we've all heard the phrase, I'm spiritual but not religious. And I would say I'm religious but not spiritual.
You're listening to Catholics in Ordinary Time. I'm Father Jack Bentz, your host. One of the things you'll know if you go to a Catholic church is that of all the things the Catholic Church does, and there's lots, education and medical world and caring for the poor and service, all that, is that every weekend the Catholic Church puts on a production, and there's opinions about what the size of the production should be and all that. But people arrive and sit in what very much looks like a theater with kind of an audience and people in front, or a congregation and presiders, however you want to say it. And they expect, preaching and maybe some good lighting so you can see things, a good sound system. And we almost always anticipate some music to support the liturgy. And this is almost always done by volunteers or underpaid folks. And yet it's super important at the same time. So often there's kind of a disconnect here around the expectations and the resources used to meet that expectation. So it's in that vein that I was interested in talking to people that lead music in spaces. And the guests that I've had, that I have in this series, are not very representative in that they're usually well-educated, great experience, super good at their job, and usually have a position, that hopefully more or less compensates them for the work they do. My guest this week is Dr. Ben Stone, and he is no exception to this list of luminaries. He currently works and teaches in a seminary training program for men training to be priests, as well as working in a parish, and has his doctorate and is a brilliant organist and has led volunteers for years and has a lot to say about how music can work, how it does work, and is a real bright spot in what's possible in liturgical performance slash music and support of the liturgy. So please give it a listen. I hope you enjoy it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad for the opportunity and for my good friend Daniel Denka for putting us in contact. It's always great to have colleagues in the field, and I'm glad for the opportunity to talk to you. That's right. So it's not St. Mary's. I'm at Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology. Yeah, 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 yeah. And the clarification we always have to make is that it's not Sacred Heart Detroit, where there are two Sacred Heart major seminaries. So Sacred Heart Detroit for the archdiocese there, and so where I work, Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology is run by the priests of the Sacred Heart, and traditionally served diocesan and religious vocations, but focusing mainly on later vocations. So we have seminarians from kind of the standard age, mid-20s, to we've had seminarians in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and even one who was ordained last year at 70 years old. Um, and we also have a partnership with St. Francis de Sales Seminary, which is the house for the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. Um, all of their seminarians come to us for their academic classes. That's right. We have an international program that mostly focuses on English studies and culture, but we also have a bridge program where international seminarians can come with us to study English and then bridge into the MDiv, which more and more we're seeing dioceses sponsor seminarians who are coming from other countries, but ultimately for ministry in the United States. And so we have a specialty in that, in training seminarians who may not be from the United States, but ultimately will end up ministering here. We're just getting past it. October is always the craziest month of the year, and so I'm kind of able to take a load off now. But things are ramping up for the students, of course, as we get close to the end of the semester and final exams and things like that. Yeah, so my primary role is I'm in charge of liturgy and music for the school. So I plan and execute all of the music for the daily orarium, morning prayer, mass, and evening prayer every day, as well as any additional events. I also train all of our ministers, coordinate that, the sacristy, decorations, basically anything that happens in the chapel is my domain. Um, but I'm also a professor and usually teach one course a semester, either in Catholic studies or sacred music. It is, yeah. We have it has a lovely acoustic, so it's a great space for music. Um, for liturgical action, one of the things that's wonderful is that there's so much space in the sanctuary area around the altar. So liturgical movement, ministers going around, incensation, all of that is a breeze compared to where that space could be much smaller. But of course, it was built primarily for the priests of the Sacred Heart. So it's a regular occurrence, and the space was planned for a large number of concelebrants, which we usually have. So there's always space around the altar for concelebrants, also ordinations. If you imagine a large group being ordained, there's plenty of space for everyone to lie prostrate. So it's a makes liturgical action quite facile. Uh, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then, yeah. So in addition to my faculty role there, I'm also in parish ministry. I split my time between Hales Corners and Northern Indiana. So I'm here at home in South Bend, and I'm director of music at St. Thomas the Apostle Parish in Elkhart, Indiana. And it was a classic case of a friend of mine was the music director there and was going to be moving and called me up asking if I would fill in as a 1 month interim while they did a search. That was 3 years ago. So, yeah, exactly. But I've really found it to be an incredibly important part of what I do. I've spent my whole life in parish ministry, and when I first started at Sacred Heart 7 years ago, I didn't have a regular parish job. I would sub various places, but I think it's important to stay connected to the real world. I I always try to remind seminarians and the people I work with that seminary is not real life. It's an environment where it's a bunch of church nerds doing church things, and that's wonderful in so many ways. But also, it's important to ground what I do and work on the ground in a parish. So, so I am from Potsdam, New York, which is a tiny college town way in the far north of the state. When people ask, like, what city is that near? The closest major cities are in Canada. So, like, Ottawa and Montreal aren't too far away. Um, but it's in the far north of the state. And it was a wonderful place to grow up, beautiful. So, I grew up in a relatively small parish called St. Mary's in Potsdam, New York. And I was always interested in music. I started singing in the parish choir in fourth grade as an alto before my voice changed, and I gradually moved my way down the choir as my voice got deeper. Started piano lessons when I was in elementary school, but being a small parish, uh, we never had a full time music director. At various points when I was growing up, music ministry was primarily a volunteer folk choir with guitars and various instruments and piano that would sing from down front. This is an old neo Gothic church built in the early 1900s. But the church does have a pipe organ. And when I was a kid, for Christmas and Easter only, the choir would move upstairs and the church would bring in an organist. We would use the pipe organ, which always really fascinated me. By the time I was about 12 years old, I was competent enough on the piano that I could play for Mass and would on occasion. And there was one Christmas where the parish organist had a family emergency about a week before Christmas and wasn't going to be able to play for the Christmas Masses. And the pastor at the time, Father Gary Giroux, who is still in ministry at another parish in the diocese, although he's must be nearing retirement now, um, is himself an organist and had taken an interest in my musical development. And he asked me at 12 years old if I would play for Christmas at the parish in that pinch. And I think he fully expected me to play on the piano because that's what I had been studying, but I wanted to play the organ. And so he said, sure. He gave me keys to the choir loft. I spent that week practicing. I didn't use the foot pedals very much. I mostly just played on the keyboard because that's what I knew how to do. But I played for Christmas that year at the parish. And that was kind of my start in the organ. And then Father Giroux quite graciously offered that the church would pay for my organ lessons. And not really as a quid pro quo, but kind of in exchange that when I was competent enough that I could do some playing for the parish. Yeah, yeah. So by the time I was in high school, I had taken over as parish organist and then eventually also directing the choir and did that all through high school until I went to college. And so it was just a natural progression in music ministry. And when I went to college, I went to University of Notre Dame and majored in organ performance and theology. And so I just continued right on doing that, was involved with choirs and campus ministry. After graduating from undergrad, I stayed at Notre Dame and did the Master of Sacred Music program there, and then stayed again and did my doctorate in organ performance at Notre Dame. Went all the way through. There are some family members that are musical. I have one aunt and a cousin, but I'm the only professional musician in the family. Neither of my parents are musicians. They were just always very supportive, and I was pretty self-motivated because it's what I love to do. And I don't know, I'm a pretty practical guy, and so I always knew that getting into church work is not what one does to become fabulously wealthy. But the fortunate thing about church music is that there are always jobs around for church musicians. Even as the field is shrinking, the number of qualified and competent people is shrinking faster because fewer and fewer people are studying the organ and sacred music. And I was fortunate enough that my graduate school was completely funded. That's the way the Notre Dame programs work. So I didn't have to take out a large amount of student debt. Yeah, and so I think I live a fairly comfortable life working in church ministry and really enjoy it. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, this is one of the biggest challenges, I think, really for anyone in ministry, whether clergy or lay ministry, music ministry, is how do you keep spiritual life alive when churches work? It takes a lot of cultivation of a way to both pray while working. As far as my own kind of spirituality, I've grown more as an adult in appreciating the spiritual side of the faith. I always used to say half jokingly um, to people, you know, we've all heard the phrase "I'm spiritual but not religious," and I would say I'm religious but not spiritual. so I've grown in that, but I've also always been attracted to prayer in the more communal liturgical style. You know, it's one of the wonderful things about Catholicism is we have it's there's so much about Catholicism is both and. We have both free prayer, our own individual prayer lives, but then also we have the great gift of the liturgy. And part of what I do, because we have the liturgy of the hours and mass every day, is I'm able to pray the church's prayer in community every day, which is a real gift. We also, so at the seminary, we have adoration of the Blessed Sacrament 3 times a week, and part of that is because it's generally a good practice, especially for seminarians, but really for anyone. But also because the priests of the Sacred Heart that founded our school, part of their charism is uh, adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, which goes back to their founder, Leo John de Hone, who really emphasized that as a ministry for the church, that taking prayer to the Blessed Sacrament, but then being sent out from that into service in the world. And so that provides opportunities for me that I can take private prayer in that quiet time in front of the Blessed Sacrament. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So I mean, I've spent my entire adult life working with volunteer musicians, choirs where uh, people bring what they have, might not even read music. In my parish choir, I have folks that don't read music, and I consider it a challenge and something I really enjoy of kind of surprising the people that I work with, the choir members, with what they can actually do. Because so often I find when working with folks who aren't necessarily professional or trained musicians, um, that music directors will kind of assume that because they're not professionals that they can't do certain things. And I find that if you come at say directing a volunteer choir with the attitude of a teacher, that we're going to find the potential of this group and maximize it. And that's always what I've done. I have much more experience working with volunteer choirs than with professionals, um, and I find it really gratifying to produce beautiful music. It doesn't necessarily have to be complicated, or but with folks who really love to be there and are there because they want to be there. Hmm. 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 Interesting. Yeah. We're all called to ministry kind of in the model of a shepherd. And if you think, I like to use this analogy with seminarians. If you think of a shepherd's role is to guide the flock, but it's not to be static. That we're going to somewhere, but you have to bring everyone along. And so that's the approach that I take to it. And so I've been, I guess, fortunate in that I haven't received a lot of negative feedback, certainly from this congregation, mostly positive. I consider myself a strong Vatican II Catholic. And what I mean by that is fidelity to the church's documents and the principles in there, especially Sacrosanctum Concilium, the Constitution on the Liturgy. And if you read that document, what it puts first and foremost, and it says is the hermeneutic by which the whole document should be read is fully conscious and active participation. And so everything I do is with that in mind. And so I've tried to foster, and I think successfully, a culture of more active participation in the congregation through singing. Now, um, maybe it's just me as an organist talking, but I find that the pipe organ is the most suitable instrument for accompanying the voice. It produces sound the same way as the voice. It's a wind instrument. It doesn't rely on artificial amplification. You don't need to, if it's built properly, you don't need to mic the organ. It fills the space with sound. And part of the training of an organist is learning how to, if they're trained well, to accompany singing in a way that's supportive and uplifting, which has to do with, I could get into the weeds of specific techniques as far as rhythmic vitality, allowing time for breaths between phrases so that the people singing can really follow the organ. And so I try to minimize use of amplification as much as possible. When folks in the pews hear other voices pipe through the sound system, and the church is filled with sound that isn't being needing to be produced by them, the natural response is, well, I don't need to sing. I can just listen. I've kind of experimented with this at the seminary over the years, and I've found that people are much more willing to sing if there isn't a cantor or a choir being blasted over the sound system. Yeah, 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 yeah. I also like to say that so much of music ministry is how it's done, not necessarily what is done. You could take any style of piece, and if it's the organist or whatever musician is leading is not doing so in a way that's compelling to sing with, if it's overly loud or overbearing, if the rhythm is not clear, or if it's not supportive, if the organist or the musicians are playing too softly, any number of these extremes discourage participation. And so it's a fine line to walk as a musician, and it's unique to every space too. What solution works best? Um, and part of this is just, I've spent so much of my career working with people who are not trained musicians, and you learn things about that. If someone is not a trained singer, and you're asking them to sing, there can be self-confidence issues. Oh, I don't want other people to hear me sing too loudly, or if I can't hear myself or feel supported, I won't be encouraged to participate. And so it's kind of walking that line. If there isn't enough support, if the instruments are too soft, then people feel exposed and won't sing. Or if the sound around them is overbearing, they don't feel the need to contribute. This is not to get too far into the weeds, but one of my pet peeves in church music ministry is choirs that only sing what the congregation is singing. I believe the role of a choir only exists to sing things that the congregation doesn't sing, such as an anthem or a motet or verses of a piece. And to the extent that the choir is singing the congregational hymn, I've found in my ministry it's much more successful not to pull all of your strongest singers out of the pews and put them in one part of the church, because then all you're doing is taking the people who could be supporting those around them and putting them in one place. And then, yeah, yeah, hmm 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 yeah. And what that does is it just means, yeah, only them are singing it. And so I've experimented with, if the choir is not singing a piece just to themselves, like a communion anthem or motet or something like that, that it's much more successful to have the choir out in the pews. Because another thing, untrained singers or people who aren't confident singing are much more likely to do so if they can hear a strong voice nearby. And so I encourage colleagues in my field that while of course you want strong singers in the choir, you don't want all the strong singers in the choir. You need people in the pews to to be singing and supporting those around them. Mhm, mhm. I've been very fortunate in that I've worked with a lot of really great priests who have a wonderful liturgical sense and a care for music. Their tastes have not always agreed with mine, but so I think it's important for the musician first to realize that the pastor is chief liturgist of the parish, and that ultimately the staff needs to defer to his judgment in certain ways. And part of it is there's a little bit of a difference working with someone like me as a music director because I have extensive training in liturgy and music. So I make it clear, like when I start at a parish, not in a substitute role, but as a staff role, that while I'm a collaborative person, I'm always want to be in discussion with the pastor and make sure our visions are aligned, that I expect a certain amount of autonomy and respect for my expertise. Now, a lot of our seminarians at Sacred Heart come from rural dioceses. They're most likely going to be ministering in parishes much like the one where I grew up, where you're not going to be working with professional musicians. Or even if you are working with professional musicians, they may not have the liturgical and theological training necessary to make sound judgments about music selections and things like that. And so I think it's important for pastors to have a certain amount of expertise, knowledge of church music, and be able to guide the parish in that way. I mean, I grew up in a parish where the pastor did all the music selections. It's a balancing act and it depends on the circumstance. You know, what I always say to seminarians when we're doing liturgical training is following the rubrics of the liturgy is only the beginning, but it's also a fundamental step. And so while I haven't had to work with pastors who have not been attentive to liturgical norms, I can imagine that that can be a stressor in ministry for someone who has liturgical training if the pastor is not doing the red and saying the black, but is kind of free forming in the liturgy in a way that's inappropriate, that can be a difficult challenge. But that ultimately liturgy can't be reduced to what it says in the book. Yeah. I'm just kind of brainstorming here about uh, potential conflicts. Maybe it's just my nature, but I haven't had those kind of confrontations. So, yeah, so I guess, you know, because I've reached a certain level in my field, I've been able to pick and choose. Like, I simply wouldn't accept a job that's not paid what it's worth. Not everybody necessarily has that privilege. And so part of why I enjoy being in seminary ministry is I get to, as part of forming seminarians, is try to evangelize for my own field, not in a self serving way, but really in a way that I think is ultimately better for the ministry of the parish as a whole, which is that music is integral to the liturgy. It's not optional and it's worth supporting. In fact, I always use a quote from Father Michael Driscoll, who was one of the co-founders of the sacred music program at Notre Dame, longtime liturgy scholar. He's retired now, a priest of the Diocese of Helena, Montana. Um, and he used to say that no one goes home humming the homily. as a way of summing up just how important music is, because it's what people remember. It speaks Music speaks to the human person in a way that words and actions alone don't. And so if you're not attentive to music, it really is to the spiritual impoverishment of everybody who's in that parish. And so it's really critically important with whatever size parish to always make sure that the music ministry is as strong as possible, because that's what really impacts people. Um, mhm, mhm, mhm. It is. My experience is that I don't get a lot of pushback. Maybe it's a generational thing. I don't know. I don't want to speculate on that, but I find that a lot of seminarians today kind of intuitively get it, how important music is. The more difficult challenge I find is equipping seminarians to enter pastoral situations where they may have a liturgical vision that is somewhat different from the culture of the parish, and how to minister in a way that is pastorally sensitive. I think we've all heard stories of pastor X, Y, or Z comes into the parish and tries to impose a liturgical vision that's out of sync with that parish and ends up alienating a lot of people. And so it's a fine line of, if there are problems in the way the church has been celebrating mass, is how do you work towards liturgical correction or a positive liturgical vision in a way that isn't alienating of people? Yeah, sure. So I like to think of this. So there are two kind of streams that are going on in my head. The one is um, fidelity to the vision of the church in its documents and its history and tradition. And so, for instance, Sacrosanctum Concilium is very clear, and documents going back before that, such as Triales Solicitudini, and going all the way back even into the Middle Ages, that Gregorian chant should have a pride of place in liturgical ceremonies. And the important thing is not that this is an arbitrary distinction, but why? Why would the church say that? And part of it, and the biggest part, is that this is a repertoire that most aptly fits the liturgy, because the sacred liturgy, especially the Eucharistic liturgy, is the meeting of heaven and earth. It's something that should be sacred, sacrare, to set apart from our ordinary lives. And so, to the degree that music sounds like or feels like something that we experience in our everyday lives, makes it less suitable to the sacred liturgy. Whereas Gregorian chant, if you just hear Gregorian chant, even if it didn't have any words, you'd instantly recognize that as sacred. Okay, so, and been this tension, if you study music history going all the way back to the Middle Ages, between the sacred and the secular. How much secular musical influence is appropriate in the liturgy? When you think about some of the earliest papal pronouncements we have on music going back to the Middle Ages are, you know, whether polyphony should be allowed, any kind of music that has more than one voice part, because it starts sounding like the music of the world. So that's kind of one stream, is fidelity to a liturgical vision and what the purpose of music in the liturgy is, which is ultimately uplifting souls to God. And it should draw us out of ourselves and into contemplation of the sacred. So it should be something different from what we listen to on the radio. That's not to say that contemporary music doesn't have a place in liturgy or in in people's faith lives, but there's also a distinction between music for devotional purposes and music for liturgical purposes. That's important to keep in mind. So that's one stream. The other stream is just going back to my father, who taught me a lot about building trades and handiwork. And it's you don't use a hammer to try to drive a screw, using the right tool for the right job. So there we have to think of music as a technology. Um, and okay, so we want to foster fully conscious and active participation. So that means that the music has to be something that's appreciable to everyone in the congregation, that fits with their cultural context, whatever that may be. In my case, a kind of suburban small city parish, but that might look very different depending on what kind of parish setting you're in. Also, okay, if you want to get a large group of people to sing together, what kind of music is going to do that? And there, music history has an answer. We have to look kind of to the Protestant Reformation actually for this. Um, what kind of music arose out of traditions that prized congregational singing as a value? And the kind of music that came out of that are things like the Genevan Psalter and the German hymn tunes, and then later English hymn tunes, which have a regular meter and and are rhythmically predictable. The kind of music that someone who's not musically literate can easily pick up and sing. Analogies to folk music. It's not. It's quite significant actually that a lot of the Catholic contemporary music that arose starting in the 60s and 70s wasn't using popular genres of the time, such as rock and roll or R&B or disco, but it was modeled after folk music, because folk music is the indigenous music that that communities produce throughout history, that are melodies that are easy to sing, fairly rhythmically and melodically predictable. And so I tend to choose a lot of music, uh, particularly hymns, like congregational hymns, that would be considered more traditional, not for tradition's sake, but because I want people to be able to participate. And if you want people to sing, choosing a four square metrical hymn is the way to do it. That's the hammer driving the nail, not the hammer driving the screw. If I were to choose a piece in a musical style that is much more rhythmically complex, such as what the kind of pop music that we hear on the radio, that has, from a musical perspective, a much greater barrier to entry if you don't already know it. There's a much more of a danger of it trending towards performance of the trained musicians, and it's not bringing the congregation along. So that balanced with what's the repertoire that the parish already knows, and making sure that you're not always introducing new and unfamiliar things, but that familiar music is a part of that. Um, so that, as far as just base musical style, those are kind of my two streams that I use to inform selections. So I think in our parish, so I'm one of a music staff. I have an assistant, and then there's another musician who helps lead, because we have four masses a weekend. And and one of our staff members is very much likes praise and worship style music. And so where that tends to serve the parish's needs is we'll have from time to time praise and worship with adoration. And so that it's not that music doesn't have a place in the life of the parish. It's that its place needs to be rightly ordered, just like everything else. It needs to be seen in the context of how is it going to be most spiritually beneficial. And that place is not necessarily in the weekend mass. Um, I don't see the liturgy as a place for cultural tourism, so to speak. It's not about a diversity of musical styles for musical styles' sake. Ultimately, I'll choose a piece of music regardless of its style or genre because of how fitting it is for serving that particular liturgy, whether it fits with the readings of the day or the proper texts appointed in the missal for that celebration, whether it's going to foster fully conscious and active participation, whether the text is theologically rich because people are going to remember it. And so those are my criteria. I don't consider it really a value to have a diversity of styles solely for that sake. That ultimately music is in service of the liturgy, not the other way around. Mhm, mhm. And I also have to be attentive to. We have a group of musicians, including guitars, flute, sometimes oboe, that play for our Saturday anticipated mass. And so I try to, as much as possible, align the music planning for all of our weekend liturgies. I resist the temptation to make the weekend celebrations of a parish a kind of menu. Oh, I like this kind of music, so I'm going to go to this mass. Oh, I like this kind of music, so I'm going to go to this mass. I think that this is ultimately the celebrations of the same parish community. Any parishioner should be able to go to any mass on a weekend and feel like it's that parish. Not, oh, I can't go to the 4:30 this week. I guess I have to endure the Gregorian chant at the 10:30, or oh, I can't go to the 10:30. I guess I have to go to the folk mass. I think that's really toxic to the culture of a parish. But so I have to choose music that I think will work across the different musicians that we have, If I choose a piece that isn't suitable to the guitar, I have to make sure that our guitar players are adequately supportive and have the preparation that they need to be able to lead that song in a way that's prayerful and musically compelling. Um, so that's both limiting, but also, I think, really helpful in unifying the vision of the parish. Yeah. Good question. So the first answer is I don't listen to a lot of music because I do music all the time. If I want to listen to a piece, I sit down and play it. What I listen to the most, what I love the most in all of music history across genres is music of the Renaissance. Like if you were to find me listening to music, if I'm putting on background music when I'm listening, it's Tallis, Bird, Palestrina, Lassus, Josquin, music of the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. But I also try to have a diversity of taste. Like I'll listen to a little bit of everything. There's not really music that I don't like. I'm not particularly drawn to rap or R&B, more so just because those styles focus so much um, on like spoken text and rhythm, but it's not. I like to have melody and harmony, so that my own personal taste it doesn't draw to that. But it's not that I don't appreciate those styles of music, but I guess what I would listen to most for myself would be considered classical if you were to lump things into a big genre. Yeah. Mhm. I also love listening to congregational singing. There are lots of YouTube videos of like hymns. I especially like Dutch singing, congregational singing from the Dutch Reformed Church, the metrical psalms. I love that stuff. Yeah. So mhm. Hmm. Yeah, I had a great. So a few years ago, I was in a small town in Tuscany on a Sunday. I'll tell this story just because you made me think of it. This little tiny hilltop town of about 300 people has three Catholic churches in it, and they rotate Sunday to Sunday which one they use. So I went to Mass there at one of the churches, and I looked up, and there was an old organ case in the back that looked like it had had its teeth knocked out. It was obviously some kind of like old 17th or 18th century organ that probably all the pipes were taken out and melted down from bullets during World War II and were never rebuilt. So there was no instrument in this parish. There was no hymnal. Um, Mass began, the bell rang, and Father walked out and just started singing something in Italian. And everybody just started singing that song. And so here's me, the visitors, like trying to hum along, like, oh, I kind of get the tune, but I don't know the words. But what floored me was it came time for the gospel, and the pastor stood up and started singing Alleluia, the Celtic Alleluia in the middle of this tiny town in Tuscany. And everybody was just screaming this at the top of their lungs. It's like, okay, well, some things transcend, I guess. Well, kind of professionally, I'm at a point in my academic career where I need to make some choices. Like, I've been at the seminary now for 7 years, and so I'm coming up to kind of a step. Do I go for a promotion to associate professor from assistant? I'm eligible for a sabbatical. Do I take a sabbatical? Is this where I want to be? And so I've been very happy, but in some ways, I always like a new challenge. And so I have to see, determine for myself, is this the place I want to be for the next several years, or do I need a new challenge? Of course, there are times when I wonder, oh, I could do something else in academia and always have parish work, but ultimately it's a great gift to be able to do what I love and have that be a career and not just a hobby. So I would say in that respect, I'm very satisfied and blessed that I get to do that. Um, I know. I think we've kind of gone soup to nuts. Yeah. Obviously, I could talk about this all day. Yeah, and I just I think it's so important when thinking about ministry is to recognize the good faith of people that we work with. Like even when I've disagreed with pastors or colleagues, is recognizing that no one gets into this. Well, hopefully, no one gets into this work because they're trying to undermine it or not do something that's really positive, especially for serving the people of the parish or the seminary community or whatever. And so that can be a challenge, but something to keep in mind when there are disagreements or conflicts is that no one is trying to harm souls. I would hope. The question is how do we work together to make sure that what we're doing is really spiritually fulfilling and that also isn't burning out those involved because burnout is real in parish work. Um, uh, yeah, thank you so much for talking to me. You too. Yes, if you're ever out in the Midwest, let me know. You're always welcome.
And that's our show. If you enjoyed this interview, be sure to share this episode on social media. You can leave us 5 stars on Spotify or a review on Apple, or email it to a friend. Anything you can do to invite folks to listen It really does help us to continue to produce this program week after week. Thank you.